Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. I'm really happy to be speaking today with Rob Thain Smith. He's the author of the book, Four and 20 Blackbirds, the Trial of Paul Petry, the beginning of the end of Mars Hill Church. So welcome, Rob, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Thank you, Clint. I appreciate it. Glad to be
I'm glad we got in touch. Yeah. So you're in South Africa. I'm in the UK. Neither one of us is in the States, but we have this Mark Driscoll thing in common, I guess, in some ways. I'm really fascinated to get into your story and your book, obviously. So yeah, thanks for writing. Has it just kind of come out? It's not been out that long, has it?
Right. It's just come out the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, so we're hitting it on just the perfect time. And I know you've been getting some interviews. I'm actually a part of the, what is it? There's a couple of Facebook groups, something like We Are Not Silent, Mark Driscoll Facebook group or something like that. A lot of people that were part of the Mars Hill thing in Seattle when it was in its heyday. That's where I saw the book, and I think I got a hold of you.
Yeah. The We're Not Anonymous came out in 2000 after Mark appeared to be repentant and basically says, he's got a lot of critics, but he doesn't know who they are. They're anonymous. And so Paul Petry, I think, started to be called We're Not Anonymous. And, I think there's about 3,000 people all still.
It's pretty good size.
Yeah. And it's pretty interesting.
I was going to say, so I was not a member of Mars Hill Church. Now, I did go visit Mars Hill probably when it was at its height. I was trying to think just before we hit record, what year was that we went? Because I'm originally from Seattle. I grew up there. And in fact, I went to a church called Calvary Fellowship, which had then since moved. But it was probably when they had the Ballard campus in downtown Seattle, our church was probably 5 or 6 miles from there. So it was really in the similar neighborhood. And my impression when I went to see Mark Driscoll preach, this is probably early 2000s, I would say. He was in his heyday and everything. I thought, this is nothing more than Calvary Fellowship 2.0. It's like an upgrade to the sort of vibe we had. A lot of the same musicians because I played on the worship teams at Calvary Fellowship. I played the drums, and a lot of the people that just kind of migrated over to Mars Hill. So it seemed like he was catching that sort of Seattle music scene vibe. What was your impression of the church during its heyday?
Yeah, it took us, I grew up in South Africa, very conservative. I did see you upbringing in the Church of Christ. Mine was probably not that different. We did have music, but we were all very conservative. So we went because, I always sort of leaned reformed, but not cessationist. So sort of, I liked the reformed worldview, but I didn't necessarily like some of the stiffness in it. And I tended to be a reformed guy that reformed people didn't particularly like because I was tolerant of other people, I guess. But so we went there and we enjoyed the preaching. The preaching was quite sound. And, to me, it was almost Spurgeon-like. He preached for an hour and it seemed like 20 minutes. But what kept us there was our 4 kids. I mean, our kids were teenagers and getting into their late teens, and they loved it. And we were interested in them loving church. And so we kept going, and eventually we started enjoying the music. I think Strikeforce still jars a little bit in my ears, but for the most part, we got into it, and what we liked is that they would, even though the music was very hip and contemporary, they did a lot of hymns, and so you had a lot of good theology coming through the hymns, and so we felt it was a safe church, which is what I talk about in the book. It was safe until the elders, elders, made it unsafe. So we enjoyed it. That was the same year that we went. We went from 2002, and in fact, if you went to the Ballard campus, all the desk work and there was a lot of woodwork that was just sort of dull brown. I did all that woodwork. That was my company did all of that.
Oh, right, yeah. So we have that in common too, because I'm a carpenter as well. I teach carpentry for a living. That's what I do now. I was very fortunate after I left the ministry to have a trade to fall back on. I've always been a builder and a joiner, so.
Well,
Yeah,
you'd
I'm
love what
very
I'm doing here.
fortunate
I'm busy
there.
building a little wooden runabout here in Cape Town just for something to do.
Oh, very
And
nice. Yeah, I'd
having
love
a lot of
that.
fun. A lot of fun with it, a mahogany runabout.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say, we have a couple other points of contact. So I went to Western Seminary in Portland. We were saying before we hit record, my former mentor at Western Seminary was Dr. Gary Brashears. I don't know if he's
Yeah,
retired now, but I remember as well there was a couple things because he co-wrote with Mark Driscoll a couple of theology books, kind of I think kind of from a
right.
reformed point of view. This was after my time at Western, a couple of years after I finished there. And you were
Yeah.
saying you actually had a conversation with Gary Brashears. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I basically went and appealed to him that the changes that we've been proposed flew in the face of Reformed theology. Most Reformed churches I knew were ruled by a plurality of elders, and there wasn't a hierarchy. And so I just felt like he could appeal to Mark to see the damage, the potential damage that was going to be done. And he had very little interest in what I had to say. So I drove down for nothing, although it's a pleasant drive.
Yeah. A nice trip to Portland. Well, the other
Yeah.
thing too, I'm pretty sure Mark Driscoll went to Western Seminary. He wasn't there when I was a student there. Didn't he did a master's degree, I think, at Western in Portland. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think he
I
did
want
it
to say
remotely,
there's some
but
connection there.
yeah,
Yeah.
he did it through Western, but he did it remotely. He was doing
Yeah.
it
The other
concurrent.
thing that is what?
I said when he wrote with Brashears, he was still doing it. He was still a student.
Right, right.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
still a learner there. The other thing is interesting is that probably 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years later, when we went back to Mars Hill, but not the Seattle Ballard campus. Now, my ex-wife, her brother, was involved in one of their satellite churches, I guess you could say, because this was the model. I was really intrigued by that because I was teaching at a Bible college over here in the UK, and we went down there and we visited, and he was in the Federal Way campus, one of these churches, and I thought this is such a fascinating, wild example of, we went to the service and it was in a high school sort of thing or a school. In the auditorium, there was a local worship band, some local elders, and then the screen rolled down, and it was a
Yeah.
Mark Driscoll sermon being preached on the screen, and then that
Yeah.
finished, and then the worship team came back up, finished the service, and everybody left. I thought this is just wild. I mean, Mark Driscoll's that big of an ego or whatever it was at the time that he couldn't have people preaching at his franchise churches. He must have had what, 7 or 8 or 9 campuses. He had them down in
Yeah.
Oregon as well, I think. So it was a wild
Yeah.
model
And
for
in,
ministry for sure.
and in fairness to him, he copied that model. He didn't invent it. It
Hmm.
was what these mega churches increasingly were doing, which is why increasingly he became the brand. And if you came in the 2000s, it wouldn't be unusual to have someone else in the pulpit. So Mark would preach, predominantly, but Leif Moy would preach sometimes. Mike Gunn would preach. Other men would preach. But increasingly, as it grew, he increasingly became then the main character until
The
eventually,
face of the church.
famously known to have said to the board of elders, "I am the brand." And
Yeah.
we all noticed that there's a marked shift, and it was in the 2007 sort of year. He started including himself in the sermons, and he hadn't done that in the past. So when we went through
Hmm.
Nehemiah, of course he was Nehemiah. It wasn't Jerusalem for Israel. It was Seattle and Washington State. You see, and so he started, becoming less correct in his biblical interpretation. And so
Yeah,
as he
little
became more,
interpolation or whatever you want to call it. Eisegesis,
uh,
reading himself into the
yeah,
text.
exactly,
Yeah.
yep.
Exactly. Well, take us through it because you were telling me before we hit record you were like very shortly about to become an elder at Mars. So how did it all start? You said okay, you got there and you stayed because your kids enjoyed it and there was a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I was really impressed at the time when I was an evangelical how this was a really thriving church and everything else. So your kids were into it, but then you were an admirer of Mark Driscoll. How did it go from you being a church member to maybe becoming an elder at one point?
Yeah, so my journey was a little different to most of the other elders at Marshall Church, and I objected to this, but not in a way that was negative. If anyone ever asked me, why are you not an elder? And it would have been logical for me to be an elder in some respects because I was one of the older men there. There were not a lot of older folk there in the early days, and so we were there, with intact family with So, a nice sort of normal looking family, kids well behaved and all loved Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people would say, have you thrown your hat in the ring? And at Mars Hill Church, ostensibly that was the way that you became an elder. And I just said that there's no way I would ever throw my hat in the ring. I know myself too well. And maybe if someone else threw my hat in the ring, I would consider it. But, just to me, it seemed a little arrogant to sort of say, I qualify to be an elder. I mean, an elder is to be blameless. I'm so aware of the rich young ruler coming to Jesus saying, good master, and he's saying, why are you calling me good? No one is good. So it was like, why are you calling me blameless? No one's blameless, you see. So it's, if someone wants to follow me, that's one thing. But at Mars Hill, you didn't get asked to be an elder. You threw your hat in the ring. But as they became multi-campus, there was a young man that I spent a lot of time with, James Holloman, who became an elder himself, and he became the campus pastor of a new campus. And he came and he said, would I please be an elder? And that was the first time I considered it. And so I went through, what they sort of made feel, it felt like a very rigorous process. I guess it was, numerous books and, reading all the books you're probably familiar with, biblical eldership, Strauss, and other good books.
I've read them all.
And so I went through the process and would have become an elder the same night as the trial of Paul Petry. That's the irony. I said you can't have a trial like that, and that ended my eldership. And I'm glad of it too. I did it because I was asked to. I was very busy. I had a ministry in Africa where we served AIDS orphans. That was my focal point, and so it wasn't really practical for me to be an elder, but they needed men, and I was willing to step up once they asked me. But I didn't step up in the early days because I just felt like that's not how you become an elder. You don't declare yourself an elder. You're an elder because other people see you as elder. And in that respect, I was an elder, because you can get elders that are official, and then you get elders that just are elders by their influence. And so, one of the reasons why they were upset at me protesting to the trial was because I did have influence there, and particularly in a young church ministry. I headed a ministry that cared for orphans. A lot of people admired me because of that, whether I deserved it or not. Who doesn't like a guy caring for orphans? And so I benefited a little bit from just what I did. But I will say, Clint, the 5 years we had at Mars Hill Church were probably the most dynamic, enjoyable, fruitful 5 years of our church life. And so I don't look back at Mars Hill Church. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book. So many people land and say, this is what happened and this is why it was bad. And I know a lot of good people who still love Christ that went to Mars Hill Church and had a wonderful experience. But they didn't land up all twisted in their faith and now wildly egalitarian because their wives were hurt. They just normal folk that kept on with life and went to another church that matched their theology, and generally it was sort of a conservative Baptist or not so much Reform. Mars Hill didn't emphasize the Reform, even though they were. You did behind the scenes, but publicly they were really sort of evangelicals, Charles Spurgeon-like.
Yeah, I was going to say, because Mark Driscoll, it was part of that young, restless, and reformed thing that came out. That was a big sort of movement back in the day, because I can remember I'd never heard of Mark Driscoll probably in the mid-1990s. I was a student at Western Seminary, Multnomah Bible College. I was in Portland, and a friend of mine emailed me and he said, have you heard of the swearing pastor? And I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And he said, there's this guy in Seattle, his name's Mark Driscoll, and he's becoming infamous or famous. He's dropping swear words in his sermon, and he's edgy, and he's out there. And so I looked him up, and that's probably around the time, early 2000s, that we went up there. We were going up to see family anyway. So I thought, well, we'll do a Sunday. We'll go up to this Mars Hill Church, see what the fuss is all about. Yeah. And Mark Driscoll preached, but I thought it was interesting at the time. I thought it's an interesting model, especially reflecting on, by then Calvary Fellowship had moved, and I spent years when I was when I first became a Christian back in the day. I was an evangelical. I was on fire for God. I did all that. I was a member of Calvary Fellowship, and like I said, I was struck by how similar the two churches were. And I knew a lot of people that had gone over and were playing music for Mars Hill and all that. But I think a lot of people, too, listen to the Christianity Today podcast series, which I did. I listened to
Yeah.
the whole thing because I thought I knew the basic outlines, and I'd done a lot of research. I've done episodes with Dr. Warren Throckmorton on Mars Hill, Mark Driscoll, but there's another angle to it, which I think your book is kind of picking up, isn't it? Takes us on an insider's journey, but you're not necessarily lambasting Mark Driscoll entirely. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark Driscoll became what he became because of the failure of the structures of the people that he entrusted to help him not become what he's become. We're all can easily get big-headed. Scripture says don't lay hands too early on a young man because he can't handle it. He's going to become prideful. And so I sort of take the position that the folk that let us down, that cracked the foundation of Mars Hill Church, was not Mark Driscoll. It was 4 and 20 men that Mark Driscoll went and said, "Give up your authority, give it to me." And the way that he was able to coerce them, and each one of them will give different reasons, perhaps, as to why they in unison did something that years later they all admit they knew was wrong, was having watched two of the most loved senior elders just lose their jobs overnight and be treated quite ruthlessly. And so the implication was, if you don't vote, we'll just fire you too. Even though they didn't have the authority to do that, had the elders just said, you can't do that. I mean, the authority in the church were 24 men, not one man. And the bylaws changed that, and these guys voted themselves out of power. It was crazy. It was kind of like, what happened in Germany, to where eventually no one could get rid of Hitler because he kept changing the rules, So Mark Driscoll was held to account. I observed it myself. I was very good friends with Leif Moy, the late Leif Moy. He's passed away now, but he's one of the co-founders of the church. And, I'd hear stories where Mark Driscoll would go too far and they'd come and say, you can't do that. We'd want to do something, and the elders would overrule him. And so I actually respect Mark for surrounding himself with men like that, especially as a young man. And I do believe had they exercised the courage that they should have, it could have spared Mars Hill Church, and it might be a very healthy church, and Mark Driscoll might be a man under accountability, which is a healthy place to be.
Yeah, he's certainly, I would say, looking at it from the outside, to me, he's not under any accountability because there's the basic storyline. I think it comes across in the Christianity Today podcast series, and that is Mark Driscoll, like you said, became more and more egotistical as time went on. He became the brand, the face of Mars Hill, these campus churches. He was huge. He was blowing up. He was speaking at conferences. Right. He was writing books. He was, all this stuff was going on. And then his leadership style became more bullying and more abusive, basically. And he sacked a couple of elders. And then a lot of scandals came out. There was plagiarism allegations, and he took church money and used it to put his book on the New York Times bestseller list and all this. And then when it all went down, he quit before he could really be held to account. This is the storyline that I've kind of heard essentially, and went off to Arizona, started another church, which is where he's at now, which is even more cult-like, I think, in many respects, is Trinity Church, and I think it's in Scottsdale, Arizona. What would you say to that? What's the basic storyline from your point of view? Because you were there, you were an insider watching the whole thing happen.
Yeah. So, and to be honest, I was an insider till 2007, and we left with about probably 800 or 900 other people who said, if you're not a plurality of elders, we're leaving. But
so that was the issue, was that he was becoming more and more controlling in terms of his own personal leadership.
No,
rather
at
than
that
having
point
a team of elders.
At that point he wasn't. But my wife and I, we had been in a church where we were shunned without due process, in a place where one or two men had all the power, and so we were not prepared to attend a church like that. So we left a thriving church that seemed quite healthy because they changed the bylaws and it was top down after that. And so we just left quietly.
Right.
And
so you saw the writing on the wall, essentially.
Well, and even if Mars Hill had thrived for the rest of their life, that's just not the kind of church we wanted to go to. We wanted a church where one man doesn't have all the authority. And so we just quietly left. What drew us back in was that in October of 2013, a man who was a leader in Seattle, fairly well known, came to me after an event and said, cautioned me and said, I understand why you discourage groups from inviting Mark to speak. And I said to him, because I had done that with groups like New Canaan Society and other groups that I have some influence in. And so I said, well, why? He says, well, because the level of abuse is starting to become talked about, and it's shocking. He said, it's run like the mafia. And I said, well, why is no one talking? They said, they literally are afraid to talk. They are afraid. They've signed NDAs. The church has got money to come and sue them. They signed NDAs because if they didn't sign an NDA, they didn't get any severance. And so I said, well, as I had nothing to lose in 2007 when I stood up and said, you can't hold this kind of trial for Paul Petry, I at that time said, well, I will start talking about it then. I'll tell their story. And so we started doing it on the Facebook. And I opened a blog called Musings from Under the Bus. And then we started later on, We're Not Anonymous. I started a group saying, repeal the bylaws. This is now 6 years after the bylaws had changed. I started a Facebook group that still is active. It's got about 1,500 people in it, saying repeal the bylaws, exonerate Paul Petry. And so we started then telling the stories, and that began a very tumultuous 2014 for Mars Hill Church. And the goal was to get Mark to stop. It wasn't to defrock him or to chase him out of town. It was just to get him to stop being abusive. You know, he has a very,
right.
very,
so you were trying to curtail his worst impulses, as it were.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. So yeah, if people didn't hear that quote, if it's in the Christianity Today, I'd never heard it until I heard the podcast series, and it was basically, I don't know what the context of it was, but Mark Driscoll said something to the effect that, you know, there's going to be a pile of bodies behind the Mars Hill bus when we're done. Yeah, like you either get on board or get out of the way, and if you don't, you're going to get run over more or less. And that was such a ruthless, cutthroat way to say, hey, this is our church vision here. You know, get on the bus or get run over. There's going to be a pile of bodies.
It comes right back to the book, because that he said that the night after he fired Paul Petry and Bent Meyer. And so here he's just now decided they're not on mission for just simply saying the authority needs to stay with the elders. What they proposed, very, very kindly and in the most soft language, was that the base authority should still stay with all the elders, and the elders delegate authority to an executive team, but that executive team can always be overruled by the elders. And all of us would have lived with that. And so it wasn't as if they were trying to take the church over, or they were just saying, no, let's not make this drastic change. For that, they got fired. And, 3 weeks later, called the entire church to shun the Paul Petry family. And I will tell you, it's not just Mars Hill that does shunning. A lot of churches do shunning. There is very little as evil as shunning. It really is a harmful thing to the families that get shunned, especially the way that so many evangelicals do it. They don't do it with due process. They end up shunning people that love Christ. What biblical model, how on earth can they defend that biblically? You shun, if there is shunning, and I don't even think you necessarily shun an unbeliever, you say you treat them like an unbeliever. Well, how do we treat unbelievers? Well, we're kind to them. We share the gospel with them. We invite them for a meal. But if there is a case for shunning,
Christians aren't.
It's supposed to be someone who has rebelled against God, has sinned, won't repent on that sin. They've been found doing something terribly bad, robbed a bank or something, and he won't repent. So, okay, don't have anything to do with that guy. But all these people in the evangelical churches that are getting shunned by authorities who don't like what they say, don't like their objections to their questions, you see. And so we found so many people that are amazing Christians who have been totally shunned by a church, and it is extremely harmful. It's emotionally harmful. It was so hard on my wife and my family, because we got unofficially shunned by Mars Hill. Paul Petry is officially shunned. And you just lose your community just overnight without due process. And so the community that's called to shun you, they don't know why they're shunning you, because the elders say, trust us. We don't want to get into all the nitty gritty. Well, what the heck has happened? Is it a child molester or someone that didn't like the color of the curtains? I mean, it's you have no
Yeah,
idea.
it's pretty big spectrum. Yeah, you're just not
Yeah,
being told.
right.
Well, yeah, and
And there's
that's to me where
and there's a new tool. There's a new tool that they're using, and Mark Driscoll leads this, and that is the Jezebel spirit. You're
yeah,
hearing him
I've heard
say
him
more
say
and more
that.
the Jezebel spirit. Well, how if you're if I come to you, Clinton, and say you have the Jezebel spirit and it's problematic, how on earth do I prove that in any kind of reasonable judicial setting? Go on,
Yeah, and how
because
do I
that God
defend
will,
myself against it?
yeah,
That
and
God
if
told
God
you I have
tells
a
me,
Jezebel spirit.
yeah, and then half the time, if you defend yourself, that's proof that you've got it. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. See, they're fighting back. So proof of the
right.
Jezebel spirit.
Yeah,
Well, let's go through it because this is the interesting part about the book. Let's maybe lay the context. How did it go down? So you mentioned the trial of Paul Petry. What was the run up to that? You kind of alluded to it. It sounds like it was a struggle over whether or not Mark Driscoll was going to be allowed to have sole control, I suppose, or more control rather than having a team of elders. What was the actual trial bit? How did that whole thing go down?
so the church has just been wonderful. We're all participating. The average church member knows nothing. Even the elders had no idea what was coming because it was just a routine annual review of the bylaws. Yes, some changes, but there were some subtle things that occurred, and one of them was, and I just heard this because I was close enough with the actual elders because I was in the process of becoming an elder, is that Driscoll and Jamie Munson had handed out bylaws and said to them, "We don't want to have any discussion this time. So if you've got any comments, just send it to us privately. No discussion amongst the elders, no debate, you see." And then we're just going to have an up and down vote. Well, to change bylaws, you just don't do it that way. So that was a little odd, but the average church member had no idea. Most of us had no idea. And I remember attending a Sunday service, and Mark was again preaching about him being Nehemiah. And there's one there he said that he had this martial art expert who used to train guys. And he said, when guys are rebellious, what do you do? And he said, well, he said, if they aren't following my guide, I break their noses. And so we've got a bunch of guys with
Okay.
broken noses, you see. And he said, I was taking copious notes, you see. And it was like, boy, he's really zeroing in on people that are not on board. And then after that, they had a meeting, and Paul Petry and Ben Meyer got fired. They had no idea it was coming. And the church
Totally out of
didn't
the
know.
blue.
The church didn't know. I didn't know. So I wasn't good enough. I'm very good friends with Paul Petry now, but at the time I was not. So he didn't call me and say, Rob, guess what's happened? Nobody knew. And then the next night, my wife was counseling at Mars Hill Church, and so I went to go and pick her up. And one of the young men that I was friends with came out of the church crying his eyes out. And I said to him, what on earth is going on? He said, he's just heard that Ben Meyer and Paul Petry have been fired. And that was the reaction of the average church member. These were dear elders, you see. And so the church
Absolutely shocked.
immediately, they went into a frenzy. And we had church bulletin boards then online where you could discuss anything, you see. And so everyone was discussing this, so they shut the boards down, saying, trust us. And they wouldn't say why they were fired. And so this just became more and more questions, and the harder they tried to contain it, the sort of worse it got, you see. And then they eventually said,
Yeah.
that they've been fired, and now we're going to see if they still qualify to be elders. Because under the bylaws, you couldn't lose your eldership unless there was a charge against you. You couldn't just be asked to resign. You had a lifelong
Yeah.
tenure, which I don't necessarily agree with. But what the heck? I don't care if a church
Yeah.
decides to do that. But you couldn't de-elder somebody without a trial, you see. And they told both these men, we're firing you, and unless you resign your eldership, you're going to face an uncomfortable trial. And they both said, we'll face it, you see.
Right.
So
Like, yeah, you don't have. So in other words, they were pushing back, saying, "Wait a minute, we want to go on the record. Essentially, if you're going to sack me without any notification or whatever, I want my chance to defend myself in front of a panel of people, or was it just in front of Mark and his closest associates? Who was conducting the trial?
The 24 Blackbirds, the 24 elders.
Right.
You see, that's where the
So
title
they
comes
brought
from.
Paul Petry up, and yeah,
And so
him and the other guy, they
here was the problem, and this is why I sent an email the night before the trial saying, if you have a trial like this, it'll cast a shadow that'll never go away. And it almost proved to be somewhat prophetic, because I said, you can't
Mm-hmm.
trust the verdict of a bad trial. But
Yeah, like
here's
the
what
kangaroo
happened.
court.
The 24 elders were really a jury, and the accusers, the prosecutor, and the judge were all the same parties. You see, I mean, that's patently unbiblical, let alone unjust. Our U.S. justice system is quite biblical, actually. You're allowed to have representation. You've got to have witnesses. You can cross-examine the witnesses. You've got time to prepare. Paul Petry wasn't even allowed to come to his trial until my email got to the elders saying, you can't have a trial with the guy absent. And so they invited him to a trial less than 24 hours before the trial. The guy was in emotional distress because he'd lost his job. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't
Yeah,
know what the
absolutely.
charges were. He went into this trial
He was
without
in the
knowing what the
dark.
charges were, you see. And so it was just a total kangaroo court. And so the church, I mean, it happened so suddenly, and then the church was in turmoil. The problem was, and eventually they did away with everyone's membership and said you have to re-up your membership and agree to the new bylaws. Well, 900 people left, you see. Most churches wouldn't survive that, but Mark Driscoll at the time had a few guys writing very big checks. He could survive it financially. And the reason it collapsed in 2014 was because enough people withdrew their giving that they couldn't survive it.
It wasn't financially sustainable.
Right. If Mark had enough benefactors, he would have survived 2014 and just kept on trucking. But enough people pulled back their donations that it just was not economically viable to stay. And at that point, Mark took off.
When we come back in the second half of this conversation with Rob Thain Smith, we're going to get into the actual mechanics of the trial of Paul Petry. I want to ask him exactly what went down, how did it all happen, and then where is Mark Driscoll today? So we get into a lot of stuff in part two, so come back in just a few minutes. I want to mention real quick what's coming up here in the next few episodes. I just had a conversation tonight as I'm doing this recording with my very good friend Janice Selby from Canada, and we talked about her new book, which is called The Guru Gene, From Blind Faith to Clear Thinking in an Age of Influence, and that is coming out the end of August. So that episode with Janice is going to be coming out probably end of August, early September to coincide with the book's launch. You can have a look. I think it might be available for pre-order pretty soon, maybe on Amazon. That's where it's going to be available. So we're going to be talking about that. But before that, we're going to have an episode with Josh Foster coming out. That's a really good conversation I had with him a few months ago now, actually. But he's a former missionary kid. He was on the Logos and the Doulos. He was on these mission ships as a kid. Has a fascinating story. He then deconstructed, and now, as someone who walked away from the Christian faith, he is a therapist. He helps people deal with religious trauma syndrome. So there's a lot of overlap between what Josh and I talk about and what I talked about with Morgan Piercy a few months ago. Kind of a similar story. So we had a lot in common. And then also I talked to author Meg Calvin. So we've got a few episodes coming out in the pipeline as well. Just wanted to mention too, speaking of books, I was talking about Janice Selby's new book. You can always check out my book, which is called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. That is available exclusively on Amazon. You can pick up a Kindle version, a paperback version, or my Audible version, the one I narrated, telling my own story. And I'm busy working this summer on my next book. I'm working on that, getting together something along the lines of how to leave Christianity and rebuild your life afterwards, something about that. So basically the book is going to be exactly what it says on the label, on the tin, as it were. I want to help people to walk away from their Christian faith and rebuild after deconstructing. So that's what we're doing, going back and digging up some really old podcast episodes that I did years ago, 2018, 2019, digging up stuff from the archives and working through some of the really great conversations that I've had over the years, way back when this show is called the Mind Shift Podcast. So really good. I'm really excited to be working on the book. I've got about 6 or 7, 8 chapters maybe written so far, kind of in a rough draft stage. So it's going really well, and I'm really enjoying the process. So I'll be sharing more of that as time goes along, and we'll see how we get along with that. All right, let's get on back into this conversation with Rob Thain Smith. We're going to continue talking about his book, 4 and 20 Blackbirds, which is all about Mars Hill, the whole Mark Driscoll church, or maybe we should say cult, and the trial of Paul Petry. You're alluding to the fact that these 24 elders, these 24 Blackbirds, they were sort of colluding with Mark Driscoll to run Paul and the other man out, or were they just bowing under the pressure?
They were all good men, well-qualified men, under the rigorous process that Acts 29 recommends, which is quite amusing because they approved the lead pastor in like a weekend. And then they tell these guys to go back and start your church, and then you got about an 18-month process to find a man and qualify him. It's really quite amusing, and maybe part of the problematic DNA that they've created, where they've got immature men who are too insecure to get mature men, and so they spend a lot of time trying to find the right guys to sort of keep propping them up. But the 24 men, all of them, if you knew any one of them, were wonderful men. You see? They were not individually Mark to change it. They probably in their heart didn't want to change it, but they just watched two guys get fired. And in fairness to these guys, they weren't all like this, but some of those elders were busboys before they became elders, and now they're earning six figures with a big book allowance. Some of the wealthy billionaires that supported Mark would fly them around. I mean, this was a very heady thing to be an elder at Mars Hill Church. You see,
right. So they didn't want to lose their benefits, and
so it was just, and this is the purpose of the book, is that good people can really fail in leadership if they don't have courage when they feel that tang in their heart that the decision being made needs to be spoken out against. You see, because even prior to the trial, there were folks saying to Paul, no, your objections are reasonable. We need to have a vote on this, and yet they all unanimously voted Paul guilty. 19 of them, 7 years later, said, we knew it was wrong. We shouldn't have done it. And they didn't. And that's why I chose the title. If you don't, if you're in England now, so in the British Commonwealth, more people know Sing a Song of Sixpence, but not all Americans do. But, when did the birds sing? When the pie was open. Why didn't these guys start singing right after the trial? They didn't. They waited until they became victims of Mark's abuse 6 years later before they started singing. These guys held that terrible decision in their heart and stayed quiet, knowing that it had decimated and really been destructive to the Petrie family and to other families, including me and my ministry. I mean, it was very harmful to my ministry. And I just kept quiet about it. I just thought, God's in it. He can rebuild it. And so it's just amazing that good men, they weren't colluding with Mark. They didn't all go say, let's get rid of him. Everyone was shocked that the men got fired. Then 3 weeks later, they got a trial saying, okay, what's your vote now? You see, they just watched two guys get fired. Well, what's your vote? Well, 24 men prefer to vote unanimously, keep their jobs, keep the tension down, or whatever their reasoning is at the time. And I've spoken to several of them, and they have different reasons why they cowered when they should have had courage. And so the book.
What were the charges that laid? I was going to say it's a cautionary tale. Well, what were the actual charges, the allegations against Paul Petry? What were it was trumped up or what? I mean, like you say, they had to have some quote unquote charge to lay at his door to say, this is why we've gotten rid of you. What was the actual charges they put against him?
This is the craziest and the saddest part of it. There were two charges primarily. One is that he basically violated elder protocol and disrespected spiritual authority, even though under the bylaws there was no spiritual authority over an elder. There's no one to disrespect. You don't have an authority over you as an individual elder. 24 you have, you see. And so there was that charge, and then the other charge involved me. Paul Petry knew that I had an interest in church discipline. I had studied it. I had seen it go wrong 1,000 times. I've very seldom seen it go right. Perhaps one time, under of all people, Doug Wilson. Very judicial.
Really? One thing he's gotten right.
Very judicial, and exonerated a man that deserved to be exonerated. It was very emotional to me because our family were involved in a church discipline. There was no due process. You see, so to watch due process was very heartwarming and comforting. And so I had 2 or 3 years earlier, and I've got it in the book, and I actually got the letter I wrote to the elders in the book, seen them handle a young lady without due process. And I said, hey guys, we risk becoming an abusive church if you handle it this way. You need to handle it this way. And taking a lot of it from a book that you may be familiar with called Churches That Abuse by Enroth. Just talking about how there's shame and there's lack of due process. And so Paul Petry knew I had an interest in it. So he came to me saying, help me write, because what happened in the existing bylaws, which was terrible, is any two elders could just tell a member he's not a member anymore. You see? And I discovered that through taking a young man who has had marriage trouble, and the elders, and this is also in the book, the elders said, we're about to throw you out. And I said, well, you can't throw him out without due process. Oh no, the bylaws allow any two elders just to throw someone out. Well, that's called excommunication. You see? So I raised a little bit of a stink about that. And so Paul Petry came and said, help me rewrite that. And what he rewrote was a very good way of handling an errant member. And so they said that what he violated elder protocol by sharing that document to a non-elder. That was a charge. Now, I was about to become an elder. I had an interest in the matter. I was highly respected at Morris Hill Church because of my ministry. Everybody knew who I was. It's almost laughable that he would get charged and fired and defrocked for coming to me and showing me the bylaws. You see? They're not some secret holy grail from God. They're just bylaws, for goodness sake. You see?
Yeah,
and then he also went and he talked to the lawyer, and they charged him for talking to the lawyer. Paul was the church lawyer. He was a lawyer. And so he went to the church law, the official lawyer that they paid, because he'd given up his law practice for being an elder, and they charged him. That was a charge against him. I mean, the charges were ridiculous. They're frivolous. They're just
very trumped up.
And he was guilty of those charges. You see, and that's why all these.
Of course he was.
He was guilty of them. Well, yeah. If he'd had any kind of Presbyterian type of church trial, the guy representing him, whether he's a lawyer or not, would say, these charges need to be dropped. There is no case here. These aren't valid charges.
Yeah.
It's like saying, I'm going to charge you having you've got a gray beard. We're going to charge you having a gray beard. Well, who said that's against the rules? Well, you should have known that. Well, I mean, it's just nuts.
Yeah, just crazy.
And so this guy loses a six-figure job. He's one of the most popular elders. He's now going to start again, rebuild his law practice for the grievous sin of showing me the bylaws, trying to make a biblical process for an errant member so that there's due process when a young man is going to get thrown out, and for seeing the lawyer. I mean, it's laughable. They destroy a man over that. You see, but the real reason they destroyed him is because he had influence over the other elders, and he would have probably been effective in not allowing the bylaws to be changed as radically as Mark Driscoll wanted them to be changed. And the change was, technically they had an executive elder board, but the way that they put the executive elder board together, Mark picked them. And it was almost impossible to dismantle that.
Yeah,
and so
they
Mark
were
had the
handpicked.
power. Mark had the power, you see. And so it changed the dynamic quite significantly.
But I would say, I mean, looking at it from the outside, it does strike me when I listened to the Christianity Today series, obviously it's coming from an evangelical point of view, but what kept striking me over and over and over was the cult-like aspects of what Mars Hill became, because what you just described is a classic cult model of leadership where you have a leader at the top who's accountable to no one, essentially. He's got a loyal team of close lieutenants, kind of sycophants around him, and the power and authority flows down from that, and it's all enforced, So here's a guy that bucks the system, and he's dispensed with, which is another aspect of cult shunning and excommunication. Right. That's what cults and groups, high control groups do. And I kept saying, I wonder if they're ever going to say in this series, Mars Hill basically became a cult of personality centered around Mark Driscoll. They never really went that far. What's your assessment of Mark Driscoll today? Because I look at him in Arizona, and I think he's basically running a cult of personality. My assessment is he went to Arizona and said, I'm going to start another church, and I'm going to ensure from the beginning that I will not face the problems that I had in Seattle. I'm going to construct it where I'm totally in control. And we've heard stories of abuse come out of Trinity as well. What's your assessment of it now?
Yeah, so let me comment a little bit about the series. I think one of the reasons that the series missed that was because I do think that they were convinced that it was Mark's view on women,
Very misogynistic, patriarchal.
along with the abuse. And I think that the people that attended to the era that I did would actually argue against that. I mean, half the employees at Mars Hill Church were women. He didn't object to women working. I think a lot of things have been exaggerated. Now the call for women to be mothers and for men to be providers, which is sort of what Charlie Kirk was calling men to be, is needed in the United States. We've got men that have sort of lost their way in so many respects. And so, but he wasn't against women achieving or women even teaching. And at Mars Hill, we even had women deacons, which from a reform perspective is quite progressive, you see. And so I think I get the sense that even if they didn't make it an overt agenda, that Mike Cosper and Christianity Today sort of had figured out what message they wanted to get across. I called Mike Cosper. I don't know if you remember, there was a gap when they did 4 or 5 and then they stopped, because I called Mark Cosper and said, "You're missing it. You haven't even talked to Paul Petry. You haven't talked to me. You haven't talked to Leif Moy." You see,
and
so they stopped everything.
There,
they came and interviewed us all, and here I am in the front row, in the seat, very active in 2014. I was very active. I was on the news in Seattle every 2 weeks because this was a huge story. And,
it was a massive
and I didn't
story.
want to. I'm glad about this. I didn't want to be the center of the series, but they gave me 10 seconds and it was basically saying this is one of the best churches I've ever went to. That's it. But they gave the woman, a handful of women who, and I don't dispute them feeling like they were beat down by Mark Driscoll or by the message, prominence. They even gave Josh Harris, who abandoned the faith, prominence. I don't know what he has to do with the story at all. You see, and so they seem to be, we're going to land this here, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because for many of us, it was a wonderful church. The reason it didn't become wonderful is because 24 men allowed it to become eventually a cult-like church, where you've got a leader that you obey, and if you don't obey him, you're out the window.
You're out of there.
And so my focal point is how do we become leaders that have courage when we need courage? How do we become men who go through all the qualifications and yet capitulate at the time when we really need it? And so I feel like that one thing that Acts 29 has done well, and that's encourage these men to surround themselves with elders. I'm not sure they necessarily teach them, but I implied this in the book, to give credit to Mark for surrounding himself with men, to keep him from the worst of himself, you see, and they failed him. And so they allowed him to become what he's become. You see, not justifying his abuse, but saying that the scripture encourages us not to too quickly give these young men power like that. You see, but you've got the Leadership Network. I don't know if you're familiar with them, out of Texas. They were financing all these young men that passed a Briggs-Meyer test with this high score, and character didn't matter. Leadership mattered.
Yeah, integrity.
And that character gap caught up with a lot of these guys, and you'll find a lot of them failed if they didn't have a Christian upbringing. You see, but the ones that
character, credibility, that's a big. Whatever your profession is as a leader, you're only as good as how credible you are to your followers. Well, that's my last question. I'm kind of aware of the time, but who would you say the book is written for? Who should read this book? Should it be for the survivors of Mars Hill, or just who's it for?
Look, I think it's an interesting read for people that were following the whole story from the start. It was amazing how popular that series became. This is a nuanced, I think, more accurate version of what church was like and why it collapsed. But then secondarily, I think it should be in a seminary where people want to learn about leadership. That's why it's called 4 and 20 Blackbirds. This is looking at what a board of elders should behave like, and they need to have courage. They need to, and so I at the end I look at that a little bit, and then also I think we need to be very, very wary. I've got a chapter on shunning and on the Jezebel spirit, And I will tell you what, the Jezebel spirit is just another form of control. And who is the most vocal voice about it in the United States right now? Mark Driscoll. You see, and look,
Surprise,
I
surprise.
hope Mark Driscoll brings a lot of people to Christ. The Bible says some people do it for money. He's a great orator, and he has a way of pointing to the cross that is unusually strong and draws people to Christ. But I wish he would read it and realize what he's become. You see, I mean, we're all capable of doing bad things. The rich young ruler came, good master, and Jesus said, "Why are you calling me good?" None of us are good. We're all capable of bad leadership, even if we've gone through the gauntlet of training. And so it's for leaders as well, particularly leaders in churches where it's a volunteer leadership in many cases, or it's shrouded around, our Christian faith. We need to protect the flock from people who could really harm them if we don't have courage at the right time. Yeah. So you have
So
24
like,
men that
it is.
not have courage.
He failed. It's a cautionary tale at the end of the day. Well, my concern is obviously the people who platformed Mark Driscoll when he left Mars Hill without any accountability, without facing any real church discipline, whatever it was, and then he's being platformed again. I mean, he just spoke in Washington D.C. not long ago.
Yeah.
He spoke at a big men's event in my home state of Washington State just a few weeks ago as we're doing this recording now. He's back out there, bigger than ever, and you think, wait a minute, what about all the stuff that he did, the terrible, horrible things he said and did, and he's still saying horrible things. I mean, I see him on social media, and he's, lambasting LGBTQ people, women. He's saying horrible, hateful things on social media, and you think, how's this guy still? How does he still have a platform?
So this is where I think I don't have as critical an attitude. We're all broken people, and it's not us good people saying, "Look how terrible Mark Driscoll is." Mark Driscoll is not accountable. His story is all over the place. He's got a church that's growing of 5,000, which means he's doing something to attract them. He's not saying, "I'm a mean ogre and I'm going to control you, come to my church." He's preaching the gospel. You see, now, is he being abusive behind the scenes? I remember very well, and you'd know this theologian if I said his name, but a very, very well-known theologian was invited to be on Mark Driscoll's board. And so I happened to meet him, and he came and he knew who I was. So he came and said, "Hey, Mark's invited me to be on his board. What's it? Tell me about it." So I said, "Well, let me tell you, it's not a bad church to go to as long as you don't work for Mark. If you're just in the pew, everything is fine.
You might be okay.
See, but you get into the inner circle, and then you better toe the line, and it becomes abusive. You see, and this man was quite reformed, and I said to him, "Look, I've studied your work, and you don't agree with that kind of church modeling, and you're going to be an elder and be in another state." You see, and he came the next day. It was a conference we were at 3 days, and he said, "Yeah, I've realized what you said, and so I'm going to turn it down." And by golly, I spared that guy, because that was in 2013. He would have been on the board with all that. His name would have gone down with it, and instead, Paul Tripp took that spot, and Paul Tripp got in there. And if you remember, Paul Tripp left saying, "This is the most abusive church environment I've ever encountered," and he quit. But he quit after the fire was already burning.
The dumpster fire was already burning, but it was kind of too late then. Well, all right. So your book is called what?
So just come back to Mark Driscoll. I think that he's still a powerful speaker. He knows how to capture an audience. One may or may not agree with what he's saying, but that a lot of what he's saying is fairly orthodox from a sort of traditional evangelical perspective. So, if one is in that camp and he's not abusing you, he's going to succeed. And so I don't see him slowing down. He's extremely articulate. He's brilliant. He's very clever. He's got a photographic memory. Unfortunately, he's accountable to nobody. And if you're not on board with him, he'll fire you and demand an NDA and cut your throat. You see, I mean, he threatened to end my ministry, and he threatened he said, "I've got things on you, Rob," and he had nothing on me. I said, "Look, whatever you think bad about me, I've got more stuff to add to it. I'm worse than you think." You see, and then he said, "Well, I'll destroy your ministry." I said, "How can you destroy my ministry if you're a Calvinist? Obviously, God's in it." So, I neutered him, but I was probably one of the few guys who went 15 rounds with him. You see, because he's a scary guy. I mean, he would start
Yeah,
throwing
very intimidating.
very intimidating, and so it takes a bit of courage just to stand there and say, "You're not going to intimidate me, Mark." You see, and so I was persona non grata during this 2014. I kept appealing to those elders, let's just talk about this. They were threatened to be fired if they talked to me. They were not allowed to talk to me. I hadn't been at church for 7 years, but I got involved
You're
because of the
still being
abuse,
shunned.
you see, and they were terrified to talk to me because Mark Driscoll they'd incurred his wrath until eventually he took off. And and if he is a narcissist, which his critics say he is, then he's not going to see what he's done. Because narcissists can't empathize.
Absolutely. He fits the classic profile of the cult leader.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
No, charismatic, narcissist, brilliant orator. I don't deny that. He's a brilliant speaker as far as that goes. Objectively, he can hold an audience. I mean, I saw him preach, and I was impressed at the time that how incredibly gifted he was as a speaker, preacher, whatever you want to call it. Very charismatic, very gripping, had the audience right there, and he's still doing it. He's still being platformed. Well, last question then I have for you. If someone wanted to get a hold of you, what would be the best way to do that on social media? Obviously, you've got your book, 4 and 20 Blackbirds. People can find it, on Amazon and everywhere else. But what's the best way to get a hold of you?
RobThainSmith.com. You can order the book there. Then also just communicate with me there. I'm on Facebook. Just befriend me on Facebook or send me a message on Facebook. Or RobThainSmith@gmail.com. So if you remember the Thain, which is Thain, that's a Scottish name. So Rob Thain Smith, the only Rob Thain Smith out there, and so that's how they get a hold of me. And I think it's a gripping read, just because it is it is the story of the trial itself, which was just looking back laughable, but very sad.
They weren't laughing then. Certainly Paul Petry wouldn't have been laughing. Well, listen, Rob Thain Smith, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day. Maybe we'll stay in touch, and I'm interested to hear what the reactions to the book are, but thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, sounds good, Clint. Let's do a follow-up. I'd enjoy that.
Okay, will do. Thanks, Rob. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.